Hello everyone. This is the very first Sunday of the month of October, so I would like to start by saying thank you because you're here with us. Because while we're talking about the climate crisis and many other crises, there may be certain persons, events, or groups that we forget. So today we specifically wanted to talk about the crisis, the climate crisis, by not forgetting anyone or overlooking anyone at all. So very briefly, I would like to say a few words about what I think about this topic, and then I would like to introduce our speakers. I would like to introduce them by stating their expertise. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Perfect. So there are no problems. Great. Now, as you know, these global conventions, such as the Paris Convention, as you know, recently Turkey said it's been accepted, national and international development plans, and other plans within and outside of the sectors, they are not only related to the climate crisis, but other crises as well. But we are living in such an age that we are talking about these a topic as if we're talking about an age of destruction, which is what we call this age in academic circles as well. These activities are over the level of renewal of nature. That is why we keep facing crises, especially the climate crisis, the collapse of ecological systems, lack of decision-making mechanisms, production and consumption relations being surrounded by dominance relations and power relations, and inequalities. These are things that we keep seeing everywhere, and this is what we have experienced during the process of COVID outbreak. Now, when we think about we have to now think about new methods to approach these inequalities within the scope of the climate crisis. When it comes to struggling with the climate crisis, we should not only think about the elite or any group, any privileged group, but we have to find solutions open to be accessed by all groups. Without ensuring equalities, we cannot ensure transformation, and that's what we have to focus on. Right now, unfortunately, we're not talking about biophysical impacts of the climate crisis. We are talking about social impact too, which is why inequalities keep growing. Most vulnerable groups to these crises are unfortunately those that contribute those that contribute less to these impact. And right now, the development plans that we are familiar with, as well as the investment instruments and solution-oriented approaches, they are not doing any good anymore. We are aware of that. But decision-making processes and the execution of such decisions should be thought within the framework of how power is distributed among decision makers and who participates in this process. I think answering these questions will contribute to understanding what is done and who is doing this. So this is a very complex project, at least it is for me. So we are only going to be focusing on two dimensions today. One is going to be poverty. The other is health. My name is Nuri Özbağdatlı. I am working on climate change and environment portfolio in UNDP. We're supposed to have Alper Acarlı, climate sector manager of EU Turkey, but unfortunately there was an inequality in his condition. That's why he can't be here today. He sends his apologies because there is a technical internet-related issue. Furthermore, we have other two speakers who are going to talk about new topics for us. One is Hajar Fogo. Hajar is the founder of the network related to poverty, and mostly she works on human rights. For 15 years, she was working as a reporter in human rights as a journalist and in various newspapers and channels. So I don't want to repeat her work if you already know her, but specifically last year we had a campaign where we worked together as UNDP and EU-Turkey delegation. She covered this topic so well and within the framework of our studies that it just expanded my horizons about what needs to be done. So another speaker of ours is going to be a familiar name for those who work in this field, Didem Evci. She's a medical doctor, and she works after working at the Ministry of Health and other government institutions. She is now working at leading projects under World Health Organization, especially in urban health and the impact of climate change. She will be talking about some important matters. So without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to our speakers to talk about climate crisis, this intertwined, complex web of climate crisis and its impact. So first I would like to give the floor to Hajar to talk about poverty, then Professor Didem can talk about health, and we did not want to present, we just wanted to basically have a conversation. And within that framework, if you have any questions, you can send your questions by typing them on the chat box. And Professor Didem and Hajar Hanım I will be happy to answer your questions. Once again, I would like to thank you for being here at this time of the day on this beautiful first Sunday of the month of October. Hajar, I'm not going to ask you any questions at all because you know what you're talking about. Because sometimes when we ask questions, unfortunately, we might be asking missing questions because we can't grasp the severity of situation or the topic. So you just begin. Or sometimes they ask me questions and I just tell them whatever it is that I want to tell them. So I think that was a beautiful introduction. So sorry, let me mute my phone first. So poverty is actually another dimension for the climate crisis, because in the past we used to talk about poverty and we were always talking about income or money. I mean, we have to think about the limit of poverty, we have to think about starvation, and people who are at the limit, at a particular numerical limit, are considered poor. But today, look at everybody, look at the world. The definition of poverty has changed drastically. Today, we are discussing climate change or climate crisis and poverty. And even this question means that we shall not look at this matter within the framework of income. Hajar, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting, but I think you should be select Turkish when you're speaking Turkish from at the bottom of the screen, okay? For the sake of translation. Oh, sorry. So what I was saying was that the dimensions of poverty are very different these days. We're not only talking about an income or numerical limits anymore. That's not a definition that we can posit because we discuss, for instance, right now we are discussing poverty and the climate crisis. So with the pandemic, we have come to think about new limits of poverty. When the pandemic first started, everyone was saying this: we're all in this room and we are all equal. Your ethnic background, your language, your nationality, it did not matter because you were all staying in the same room. But a few days later, the pandemic showed us that immense inequality in terms of language, culture, and poverty. We realized that we were deeply embedded in inequalities, and the climate crisis is not that different, actually. So on March 11th, when the Ministry of Health said you have to stay home, 3 days later, people started to make phone calls. We don't have diapers, we don't have food, etc. So these people are people that, maybe these people are people that we know, we have known them for years, but poverty immediately turned into starvation with such a crisis. So that was actually terrifying. because that goes to show that maybe other concepts must be included when we are discussing poverty. It also means that such disasters would yield terrible results, terrible consequences. Look at the pandemic, for instance. Poverty immediately evolved into starvation. And during this time, I think it was on March 18th, we started to talk about this concept of poverty because we did not have any means to go out. We were not able to send food to anyone. And really, we had people with no money in their bank accounts. We were talking about social isolation, but people were living in houses with just 1 or 2 rooms. So that was borderline impossible. So those above the age of 65, call us if you need anything, so we are going to shop for you. But if you don't have money, you cannot place a phone call. Or children, they had no access to remote learning because, I mean, let alone the internet connection. They did not have any smartphones at their disposal. So that is exactly why we have to think about this framework. So any crisis, I mean, a climate crisis is also a type of crisis we have to focus on in this framework. Much like the pandemic as a crisis, of course. So as a crisis, pandemic showed us this deeply embedded poverty. And by that we mean those that work daily, like construction workers, street vendors, flower vendors that on the street, I mean. So these people who work without social security, fulfill their needs on a daily basis, and they are fixated on that part. And the most important part of this was the poverty as a legacy left to their children. So that's why during the pandemic, people who had to struggle with poverty and starvation had to establish their own strategies. I mean, 74%, for instance, according to our research study, had difficulties as mothers to access diapers. And during the lockdown or isolation periods, food products, as you know, they became extremely expensive. And supermarkets started to install alarms on safety alarms on diapers or formula, and mothers with access of difficulty for diapers or formula, they started to feed their children with sweet water, just sugar and water mixed together, because it was too expensive for them. They were using tap water, despite the fact that you're not supposed to drink it in some places. So these are actually alarming within the scope of climate crisis, because no matter which household that I see, and all of my friends too, because we have seen many households with poor households. We have seen a 6-year-old, for instance, but that the kid looks like a 3-year-old because of malnutrition. These are things that you can see and observe in many of the households. Children with learning difficulties, developmental deficiencies, and that's why reports are written about them at school because of their learning difficulties, or they have asthma, or they have difficulty in breathing because of the pollution of the region in which they live, or the circumstances under which they live. So I actually call these rights of poverty, because look at some of the neighborhoods or households, especially during the pandemic. Some diseases, for instance, became additional pandemics. I mean, this is just based on my observation. For instance, in some scabies actually emerged in certain neighborhoods during the pandemic. So this is my part, and I'm sure that its health impact will be covered by Professor Didam in a minute. But we need to know about the implications of such situations, because these people have to pay rent, they have to send their kids to school, they need access for clean water. They are just locked on fundamental needs just to survive, and they are trying to make ends meet under these circumstances. So when we're talking about climate crisis, or look at the wildfire events that happened very recently, If you have no fixed income, you have nothing to replace it with. I mean, if your shelter, if your house or whatever you're taking shelter is gone in a flood, that means that your family is going, that is also considered an indicator of your family's poverty that have been there for generations. We have seen this so many times during the pandemic. Poverty turned into starvation, and it's horrifying because in future this can re-emerge in the form of drought. Maybe I should stop here. Hajar, while you were talking, I was thinking about something else. I mean, it reminded me of how options work. I mean, there are certain choices that are offered to you, but there are people who are not even offered any choices. So that's why some choices or selections are not solutions, because they actually deteriorate some situations. In addition to the climate change, there are things that we cannot change, like wildfires or floods or pollution. How can we generate selections or choices, and how can we ensure collective access? I would like to keep these questions in mind, but I would like to give the floor to Didam, Professor Didam now, because poverty and health, and especially policies or options for future have moving towards a whole new direction, because we're not just talking about health. I think it was Professor Didam who said this. This relationship between human beings and nature, it's actually an indicator showing the relationship between human beings and the nature. So I don't think we see this relationship in the climate crisis. So what can you tell us about that, Professor Didam? The floor is yours. Well, first of all, thank you. I would like to thank you, Nouri, and the team working at MARUF for this beautiful event. So I would like to pick up where dear Hajar left off, as well as the door that you opened for us. As a matter of fact, everything that forgot about was reminded violently by the climate crisis. There were diseases that we have forgotten about, and they are going to be reminded, especially some diseases that are the social indicators of health or life. I'm talking about things that would help us or hinder us from living in a healthy way. These bad circumstances will give way to the reemergence of such forgotten diseases. So everything that we have been talking about till now are the tip of the iceberg. So we use this phenomenon of iceberg because there is a lot more that we cannot see because that part is underwater. Maybe that's because the society is not ready to talk about this yet. Maybe we are not aware of these new dimensions, but still there are many things that we are still not talking about. So is everything that bad? I mean, are we completely without solution? Let's think about that, especially as a Turkish resident. I would like to talk with hope, because dating back to 1930s, we have a public health law. And within the framework of this law, we have many endeavors that we are working on. Institutions or organizations such as the World Health Organization guide us with their regulations, and our law, the Turkish law, public health code, and other organizations help us be prepared for potential issues, as I've mentioned. But like we talked about, let's talk about everything freely, things that we can foresee. But then there are things that we don't want to leave behind, and the most important ones are those who work in critical infrastructures. And this is not just a matter of health. In all policies, we call this health, but this principle keeps being put to rest. That is exactly why, because it's not just the health systems that is hindered. I mean, we have experienced floods and wildfires and COVID-19. Once the roof collapses, health is the first thing that is crushed. at the bottom level, because that's such a critical infrastructure. So that's why I'm talking about those working at critical infrastructure. So empowering them in terms of their health, right, making them healthier and making them more resistant is very important. Those who are working at water purification systems, facilities, those working at waste facilities, those firefighters, transportation workers, safety, security officers, emergency service providers, they must be more resistant, and we have to help them become more resistant. And in order to do that, we have to underline that these people are important. I think that's the only way. In public health, we always use the abbreviation under risk society, URS. So what it means is that, we say to students, when you graduate, you're going to be appointed to a new job. But before you go to your new city, look at the map of this new city. And now geographical information systems are, of course, more comprehensive. So look at the geographical location of of the city in which you're going to work soon. Look at the infrastructures. Look at the superstructure. Which parts are the most vulnerable ones? And what region would you say has the least potential for compliance? You have to know these things, because if you don't know them, you would be doing nothing more than sitting in a room by a desk doing the things that you are asked to do on a piece of paper. But if we're talking about struggling with this climate crisis, and if we want to comply with climate regulations, and this is an important matter in public health too, if we are going to put an effort into adapting human health, public health, a desk job is not going to do it. So what about these under-risk groups? So all our works with Hajar, included certain groups that she worked with, so we have to name them. But women, children, elderly, pregnant women, those that are in need of extra care, migrants. So we used to say that migrants in terms of migrating to Turkey, but we have to think about immigrants too, because the climate crisis, the climate changes, will drive us towards a new search of life. There is, looking at the projections, there is movement towards the north. We have agricultural workers. We have those living on the street, working on the streets. We have those that live alone. So they are all vulnerable groups whom we would consider under-risk groups. So what about the groups with low levels of adaptability? So as public health practitioners, we always considered COVID-19 as a drill, but in reality, we have seen that these classification of developed, underdeveloped, or developing countries was completely wrong, because developed countries was not as resistant as we thought. So maybe we should make a new classification called resistant or not resistant countries. This all boils down to making preparations. Nuri, so we always work on policy documents together, but it's basically, the situation was basically that they prepared policies, but they forgot these documents in folders, on shelves. They did not share them with the public. They did not turn them into activities. And on top of it all, they had no budget for these documents, so much so that some of them actually put obstacles before these documents, saying that this is not a priority right now. So maybe put into effect the plans that you have for the next 3 years, and we can come back to these documents later on. But right now, at this point, we see that we have to turn back. We have to come back from these endeavors. If you don't have a budget for a document, that can be nothing more than a dream. You have to include them in employment. You have to spare a budget. Unless you do them, this is all just going to be imaginary. Naturally, those with low levels of adaptability, like the elderly, those who live alone, those who are bedridden, we have to think about them, but we also have to add the element of education level. I'm not talking about ratios of literate or illiterate persons. We should focus on those who are illiterate in health or climate change. So climate change literacy or climate and health relationship literacy, these are the things that I'm talking about, because unless we have literacy in these terms, and also there are those who don't notice these concepts. So some of those that are completely unaware of these concepts. Some of them are decision makers and some of them are academicians too. So that's why we have to investigate and question what we already know. So these questions are asked because they can drastically change everything that we know about these topics so far, which is why some people might be shy about talking about them, but still we can know how we can cope with these changes, and that's how we keep learning. And the entirety of these events lead us to climate change. We walk together. Okay, well, yes, we walk together. And as Hajar has mentioned, there is a metaphor, we're all on the same ship, right? But we're actually in the same rooms of the same ship. So that's why we are impacted in different ways. But there's something that I constantly think about. Don't leave anyone behind. So how can we make this more understood? How can we make it clearer? Because when a decision is being made, you don't have to be a decision maker on a public institution level, or you don't have to be an officer or an employee or at an NGO. We all make decisions as members of the public. So yes, within the framework of the code or legislation, we should be making decisions because there are certain guidelines that keep us within the framework of said codes or regulations. But at the same time, we have to think about the culture of the place in which we live, our social frame of mind, the borders, cultural and geographical borders, because they limit us in different ways. I'm sure you remember the book Ingememet. Until he leaves the village, he does not notice that there's a different regime. So this all boils down to choices and selections. Right? A person, a family, a household, a neighborhood, a country, a society. So in order to make them more resistant, in order to add resilience to them, how should we change the perspective? Because at the level of what you've been talking about, we are only talking about poverty, and we are only talking about health and poverty. But what if we were to add novels to that? What if we were to add the situation of the members of the society and everyone who lives in the society? And if we were to build a pyramid, wouldn't we see that underneath at the bottom level of the pyramid, some people are having it more difficult, right? Because as you've already put it, plans are made and there is a particular hierarchy. And within the framework of this hierarchy, there are funds and resources being distributed. And within this process, we are talking about production and consumption. But then, when we come back to it, we see that people are pursuing privileges because they don't want to be the subaltern anymore. So unfortunately, we keep talking about development, but once it comes to talking about sustainable development, there are choices that we cannot see, that we maybe oversee. So I think this not seeing it or not hearing it was covered by Professor Didam. Ultimately, some just do not care because they don't see, they don't hear. I know that there are beautiful studies done about this. I know that Hajar and her team, for instance, are working on similar topics, but maybe some studies can be used as examples so that we can learn a lesson and maybe we can articulate some principles from within them or techniques or methods to our method of working. That's what we are searching for, actually. And once what we learn from there, we might use them in setting up adaptation strategy plans. So maybe there is an approach that you have captured, and this might be on a smaller scale, but maybe we can reach a point where we can find solutions via these methods to existing problems. So Hajar, would you like to talk about this mechanism of inequality? And if there is something that, if there are things that we don't know but you experienced, maybe you can cover them. I would be really happy if you were to talk about them. I think you covered the topic really well, but let me put it this way. The pandemic, in terms of the world and the whole world, the pandemic was horrible. And much like Professor Didam said, I think this is a beautiful example, because this, at the same time, shows that it works as an indicator of other crises to come. From my perspective, we have to think about how much or to what extent we have understood this crisis, or what kind of a strategy do we set up for this. So when you Google it or when you look for it, we see these UN headlines: "Say no to poverty," "Put a stop to starvation." But then I look at the details and I don't see anything related to them. That's why we should not just speak these big words. We cannot end poverty. Of course, we cannot end poverty and at one go, at one step. But do we have the intention to reduce poverty or starvation? So, to what extent are these words real? And what about the public? And what about the administrations? What are their intentions? And do they really set up their policies accordingly? And if that's the case, then these legislations did not work at all during this pandemic. And I'm saying this as someone standing on the field, standing out on the street. If in villages, if in towns, if in cities, people started to starve in 3 days, then you should think about what you did wrong. So if the ministry says, we sent food to 5 million people, or if the municipalities say, we've helped this many million people, but still these numbers are not decreasing at all, and instead multiplying, and if poverty is becoming more common, then that means that our strategy is wrong. There's something wrong. So experts in this topic, Didam Hoja, Nouri Bey, whoever the experts are, I don't know, NGOs or whoever is included, should be gathered around a table to set up a strategy for times of crisis. So let me give you some more concrete examples. I think the follow-up system is terrible. There are great research studies, great academic work, but this poverty is constantly moving. When every street that I walk into, every household that I walk into, I learn new things. I see a whole new aspect of poverty. For instance, if we cannot see the wounds, injuries on the hands of the mother because they have no fridge or washing machine, that's something else. Because walking into a household and saying, okay, they don't have a washing machine is something, but then seeing the wounds on her hands, the rash because she has to do the laundry manually, and using it to gauge poverty, that's something else. That's the perspective that we should use. Recently, for instance, I visited a village, and nobody is working with cattle anymore. It's completely come to an end. And I asked them how they were making a living. And the villagers there told me that everyone migrates to larger cities like Istanbul, Antalya, Alanya to work as construction workers. So then they started to give me examples. They were working as construction workers, but there were many people who had disabilities because of occupational hazards. But they were talking about this as such a normal topic that it was terrible, because they're not working with animals anymore. Nobody. So who is going to own up? Who's going to be there for that particular village? So as UNDP, maybe you can get together and talk about agricultural development with governments, administrations, whatever. But that village is there and it's almost done. So when are you going to visit? When are the policymakers? When is the UNDP going to visit that village? When are we going to talk about this particular strategy setting at a round table? When are we going to actually try to solve this crisis? So when I visit somewhere else, it was in Van, the city of Van, and I saw the same in Istanbul too. So I asked a mother, "How many children do you have?" She has this many, but but my kids are dropped out of school because they're working in textile. Maybe they can continue school next year, but you can see that this crisis is not going to end, and that kid is not going to go back to school. So it's not a matter of one kid called Ibrahim to drop out of school. We're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of kids that have to drop out. So this is the kind of poverty that I'm talking about. So if we cannot understand the pandemic properly, if we cannot see these phenomenon, we cannot find a solution. We cannot do anything. So this means that we need more social investments. So the economy grew and grew and grew. So why don't we grow? Economy should not grow anymore. Economy should constrict a little bit. And social investments must be made to grow the economy in a way to include these people. I'm not talking about new housing or new other things. I'm talking about a new strategy, a policy that is in need of development so that these kids can go back to school, because this is the only way that we can struggle with various crises such as the climate crisis or COVID crisis. Because in such places, we have to tell them these stories. When we talk about climate crisis, they actually don't realize that they are they are the ones who are suffering in the heaviest way possible because they don't have water there. But we have to tell them that this is the why. You have to do this, we have to do this. But if we don't visit that village, they're not going to have water anymore. That's why they're going to migrate to be construction workers, and then they're going to fall down from God knows what story, and they're going to be crippled for the rest of their lives. We have to place importance on their lives as human beings. Thank you. And of course, there is the process of urbanization, right? In order to have access to employment and health services, we have to think about the number of population, the population numbers in big cities, right? Yes, and especially in villages. I mean, there is only one health institution there, maybe just a small clinic, and there are maybe 10 doctors in one city. One more thing that I have to say, during the pandemic, for instance, there were many people who were not able to pay their rent. That's why they had to move out, or they had to find new solutions living out on the street. But this is not called solidarity anymore. Even that solidarity, even moving in with your distant relatives, that's not solidarity, because that means that the hosts should put one more table on, put one more plate on the table, which is yet another issue. Okay, Didam, what can you tell us about the linkage between rural and urban settings? And health, of course, because, I mean, you have underlined one thing. You have underlined the concept of preparation, being prepared for crises. So when it comes to this relationship between urban and rural settings, what would you like to say? Well, the risky part is health, because it's quite vulnerable. I mean, from a perspective of urban health, we now know that cities are man-made, human-made. That's why they have more effect on human health, which is why you cannot, which is why it's impossible to manage them. But as Hajar has mentioned, we don't feed the rural. We don't care about the rural anymore. So by feeding, I'm talking about fertilizing the land. I'm talking about deforestation there. So how will you be nourishing these places? So, I mean, the examples that we have seen during the time of COVID-19, they were great examples illustrating this phenomenon. People were not able to make a living in urban cities. That's why they started to evaluate their options in villages, or people started to move back to their villages. But once they went back to their villages, they had to face how unhealthy housing there in their villages was. It was not what they remembered. So we have, in public health, we have a concept called housing health. We call this patient building syndrome. So if people living in a building, when they enter into the building or when they enter into their apartment, they feel sick. But when they go back to when they go to their offices or any coffee shops, they feel good. That means that there is a problem with the house in which they live. So that house must be looked at. So during COVID-19, we used the slogan, life fits your home. So everyone should stay home. Everyone stayed home, but their home, but not all homes had natural illumination, natural heating. They had some of them had no water, no bathrooms. So what kind of a healthy living setting are we talking about then? Let's say that you had contact with someone sick, or you have COVID. We said you have to use separate bathrooms. But I mean, look at how the houses are made. World Health Organization and us, we were working on this project called Healthy Urban Living. I mean, urban planning should be focused on human health and health per se, and then you should plan the urban setting. But unless you do that, unless you have a second bathroom or a toilet, or if there are circumstances to which you cannot add a bathroom in a particular region, then that means that the events that are to follow are your responsibility, and they are going to be very hard to manage. And also, we have to focus on early alarming systems, early warning systems. I mean, it's not just a matter of floods, or I'm not talking about just putting a stop to one thing. I'm not only talking about meteorology or the following up on how the weather is going to work. I am talking about an early warning system for the sake of public health. Means that the public should be warned as quickly as possible so that they can prep. What should they prep for, you ask? It's very sunny, and we are going to be exposed to radiation because of the UV light coming in from the sunlight. So we shall not, and we say don't go out on the street between the hours 2 p.m., 4 p.m. But then, when I do further research studies, I find out that there are harmful radiation levels that would take 10 hours during one day. That means that I have to warn the public to protect their health. That is the groundwork of public health. You have to prevent it, and you have to be ready so that I can help them be ready. So gauging them, measuring these levels, and delivering them to the public, and making sure that the public understands this is important. In addition, decision makers should be doing something with them. So now, let's put aside houses and let's start talking about neighborhoods, social relationships in neighborhoods. So we have this great work. In public work, we work in close contact with Muhtar. Muhtar is basically the mayor of neighborhoods. So they really help us. But city councils that have direct contact with the public in certain regions, and basically anyone with social network that would help us reach a public must be empowered, because they would play an important role in prepping the public as well as managing the event per se. And there's one more thing that we should not forget at all. Once events are overcome, we should be able to continue living in a safe and healthy way. So at this point, public health would be of guidance, because it offers certain methodologies. So we were quite happy during the pandemic, and I say this in quotations, because public health was constantly talked about, and we had the option to express ourselves. But we have to express ourselves more. We have to show the tools. We have to compare what is known and what is unknown. in order to reveal actual proof. And unless you have actual true proof, I'm not saying data, I'm saying proof, I'm saying evidence. Unless you have evidence or proof, you cannot adapt the data or information that you currently have to the society. This would also mean that you cannot execute policies. You would make mistakes in that area too. And pros and cons should be revealed together too, because it's not. It's probably it's actually demoralizing to constantly talk about the cons. So when you talk about the pros, that would motivate people. That would make them feel relieved. And so we have a health impact evaluation where decision makers say, yes, I will bear all negativities because I have the funds, I have political decision-making power, I have the manpower, so I can turn it all into a positive way. And I have the technology to do that too. So at that point, we can stop saying. So one more thing, I know that the time is going on. The word smart is something that I also would like to highlight. This matter of smart things. So climate change sometimes make people lose their minds. So these smart methods might do the same thing. So we should not forget about traditional methods too. I mean, opening up wells, getting drinking water from wells, or teaching how to do these things to human beings. I think these are important parts of public health. Thank you. I mean, we keep using the word smart, but who is the smart one, or who would use the smart technology, right? So that's very important. So there are so many questions that I actually want to ask you. And the more you talk, the more I start thinking about more complicated things. But it also opens up the floor to further discussions. But Hajar was quite right in saying 17 sustainable development aims, right? But we have to provide proof. And we have to understand where are we moving towards. That is one of the critical issues that we must take into consideration. That is why when we are talking about climate changes or climate crisis or the linkages between social relations or networks, we can not only use knowledge, we also need experience. So at the point of acquiring experience, there are certain questions that I see here, but I mean, I have to ask this one question before moving on to the ones that I receive. Now, we have talked about inequality, and this is unheard and unseen, right? But that the same goes for privileges too. As of the moment that we are born, we have a privilege, but sometimes we overlook that. I mean, as long as we all have electricity in our homes, we just cannot empathize with those that do not have electricity at their homes. Unless we lose something, we don't really appreciate it. So here is the thing that here's what I'm thinking about. So I am privileged. I am educated. I am living in better circumstances, probably. But what can I do to help everyone understand this inequality? There are many with us who are here to understand, to talk about inequality. So noticing this and understanding whether or not our conditions, our circumstances are generating potential inequalities for someone else. How can we understand this? So I would like to listen to you. I would like to hear what you think about that. Hajar, maybe you can start.
I think your position is really good in that concept, UNDP. But other than that, what I told you before, it's about hunger, about the people who pass by, the paper collectors, or if in a building complex, the person who lives at the downstairs, at the bottom, the doorman and his family, and all of these things. It's impossible not to meet them, not to see them. With the economic growth, if there is a paper collector passing by, we can just look at it as just a person passing by. Or once you start talking with that person, something critical happens. Once he starts to talk, not you, but when he starts to talk. Why do I specifically say this? There are always lots of people who talk, who teach, and they tell us all these prejudices. They're lazy, they have lots of kids, they live in a certain way. So before they start telling you about themselves, we're just shaking our finger to them and we prevent them from talking or sharing. So the most important part, I believe, is actually listening to them, to learn from one another. The white collar is a step down in our welfare level. We're all going poorer. We're all impacted, maybe at different levels, but it's the truth that we will all be impacted. So without any differentiation about being a blue collar or white collar, we need to learn from each other. And there are so many things to do. As I said, like, it's not only about it's about when we go out and talk to people. When you talk about babies not being able to and there's a problem there, and if it is clear, then you have to see that there is a neighborhood that children and we forget what the situation is in a neighborhood. But maybe that's a model. Maybe it's a model of UNDP, maybe a model for a pilot study of a university. Once you achieve something there, then it can become more applicable. So there's a lot that we can all do, because this crisis will get deeper, and I believe that the climate crisis is also growing. Just like we were not enough to respond to the forest fires and we had to go there, and the solidarity networks grew, so we need to grow this solidarity networks. We need to think more as individuals. The climate crisis must be told in the poor neighborhoods in a way that they can actually understand. And why would they not join in? But they can't, because they don't have smartphones in their hands. So there is a major digital inequality, and there are certain neighborhoods with no internet infrastructure. So the municipalities don't need to research for months or years. They just need to find ways to correct this inequality. And there are no toilet paper in government schools today. So what are we discussing? It's all so clear. As long as you wish to do this, there are a lot of things to do, I believe. Let's continue quickly. I think the key word here is adaptation, and sitting at the table and partnership are the words that I hate now. So we need to sit at the table to come up with a conclusion. And it's also difficult to work with people who don't know the field. To be at the grassroots is very important. Also, one thing I need to say, we need to strengthen the connection of the youth with the with the history. And because of the COVID in the last 2 years, we lost time, and they weren't able to even mix and mingle. So and maybe they're happy. And what we talk about, and in the past with the climate change, we need to strengthen their link to the history, to the past. That's how we can strengthen or empower the rural areas. They don't know the rural. If they don't protect and save the rural areas, they won't have the opportunity to eat the apples on my tree that I grow in the city, the natural ones with the worms in them. And we need to talk about the experiences. So the round table is not enough. That corporate approach or perspective is not enough. And we need to work together, and we can mitigate it, but we can decrease